So if you've ever been around a group of photographers, you know that we speak our own language. So in this video, I'm going to be going through a whole bunch of terms and words that photographers use that you may not be familiar with, you may have heard some. If you're new starting out in photography, these would be some great things to learn. If you're just going to be going out and socializing with some photographers and want to get in on a conversation, this might be the video for you. We're going to have some fun. Stick around. So the first term is bokeh. I'll put it here so you can see what it's spelled like. I'm not pronouncing it right, but nobody ever pronounces it right. So find a pronunciation, stick with it, and the person you're talking to is going to think they're pronouncing it wrong. Bokeh. What bokeh basically means is the quality of the out of focus areas in your image. So different lenses render out of focus areas differently depending on, all of the characteristics of the lens. So bokeh basically is a way to describe the niceness, the pleasantness, the quality of that out of focus area. So if you use the term bokeh, you're talking about not necessarily the sharp part that's in focus, the subject, it's kind of everything else around. For portraits and things like that, it's when you blur the background and your subject is in focus, you want to have a nice, soft, beautiful looking background. That's the bokeh. And speaking of lenses and out of focus areas, aperture is a technical term, but it's one that we use often. Basically what aperture refers to is the width of the opening in the diaphragm of the lens. So inside each lens is a series of blades that open and close based on your aperture. A small number aperture like 1.4 or 2.0, your lens is going to be wide open. A larger number like f11 or 16, and you're going to have a really small, tiny opening. The opening in the lens is the aperture. Now the size of that opening is measured in stops. F-stops you'll see them referred to as, but it's measured in stops. Stops can also be used to describe shutter speed and things like that, but basically what a stop is, when you hear the term stop in photography, basically a stop is one. One movement from one setting to another. Changing the aperture by one stop or changing the shutter speed by one stop basically either doubles or halves the amount of light that's hitting the sensor. So if I had a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second and I halved it to 1/250th of a second, basically half as long, from 1/125 to 1/250th, that's one stop. I'm cutting it in half. If I change my aperture from f8 to f5.6, that's opening up my aperture by one stop of light. I'm basically doubling the amount of light. So that's one stop. Every one stop either doubles or halves the amount of light that is hitting the sensor. So along those lines, the term stopping down, you've heard the term stopping down. Stopping down basically refers to the aperture and closing the size of the aperture. So you're stopping down from a wider aperture, like let's say f2.8, to a smaller aperture like f16. You're stopping down. Once you hear someone say stopping down, they're basically closing up the opening, closing the aperture in the lens. So the opposite of that is the term wide open. Wide open basically refers to the maximum aperture that your lens will allow. Different lenses have different maximum apertures. Again, aperture is the opening in the lens. Certain lenses will allow you to open it very wide, certain ones not so much. So wide open basically describes the widest that your lens will allow your aperture to open. Some only open to 4.0, some open 1.4 or 1.0, very wide. So wide open is as wide as you can get that aperture. Now typically the kind of lens that allows you to have a really wide open, wide aperture would be a prime lens. Prime refers to a lens that has one fixed focal length. So a lot of lenses are zoom lenses that go from, let's say, 24 to 70 or 70 to 200. A prime lens has one focal length, so you might have 50 millimeters locked at that, 35 millimeters locked at that. You can't change the focal length, it's locked in at one focal length. That's a prime lens. Now the advantages of a prime lens typically are they can be smaller and lighter than a zoom lens of the same range, and they usually allow to have a wider aperture, so more wide open. So while a typical really good zoom lens will have a maximum aperture of 2.8, a really good prime lens might have a maximum aperture of 1.4 or even more. So a prime lens refers to a lens that has one fixed focal length. And a prime lens with a really wide aperture would be referred to as fast. It's a fast lens. A fast lens refers to a lens that has a wider aperture and is actually able to take in more light and shoot at a faster shutter speed fast basically refers to that. It's a fast lens. A lens that's not fast, you don't really hear the term slow as far as lenses go, but a lens that isn't fast is a lens that maybe, you know, has a maximum aperture of 5.6 or so, that really doesn't open up as wide and allow you to take faster shutter speeds. Prime lenses, or lenses that have wider apertures, maximum apertures, will be referred to as fast lenses. So let's get away from lenses and start talking about RAW files. You've probably heard people say, I shoot in RAW, you should shoot in RAW. What does RAW mean? RAW basically is the type of file that you're recording when you capture an image. RAW as opposed to JPEG. JPEG is the typical end result of an image. So when you're done processing your RAW image and you export it and you're ready to share it, it becomes a JPEG. Now you can shoot in JPEG on your camera, but basically what that's doing is that's allowing the camera to make editing decisions for you. So when you shoot photographs on your smartphone, you're getting JPEGs, no problem. You're allowing your phone to do its own editing and make decisions. When you shoot in RAW, basically what you're shooting is the exact scene in front of you and capturing as much information as possible in that, and that allows you later on in the computer to edit the image yourself and make whatever changes, make whatever adjustments you want to make to your own image. So when you shoot in RAW, you're basically capturing the image as you see it and not letting the computer or the camera make adjustments to it or anything, and doing all that yourself afterwards. You can shoot in RAW and JPEG at the same time if you want to do that. If you want to share images quickly, but then maybe go back and edit them later on, you can do that. But you should always be shooting in RAW, and that's what RAW refers to. So what about noise? Noise refers to what used to be called grain in film. High ISO films would be grainier. And sensors basically now, when you're shooting at high ISOs, that grain that you see now is now referred to as noise. So basically what it refers to is the amount of grain or the amount of texture that an image gets when you shoot at higher ISOs. So if I'm shooting at ISO 6400, you're going to see some texture to it, some grain, and that's basically what noise refers to. It's like digital noise. When you shoot at a nice low ISO, like 100, you're not going to get any noise. You're going to get a nice clean image. But when you're pushing your camera to the limit, when you're pushing your sensor to the limit and trying to capture images in really low light, the offset of that, the limitation, is that you're going to get noise in your image. And when you hear the term noise, that's what that refers to. Basically the effect that you get when shooting at high ISO. Speaking of ISO, there's a term that I use which probably annoys people because I kind of use it all the time, and it's crank up the ISO. And when I'm shooting in a low light situation and I'm not getting a fast enough shutter speed, or someone's asking me for some advice and they're not getting a fast enough shutter speed, I'll say crank up the ISO. And I use it all the time. It's probably it's annoying at some point, but it's a term. It's what I say. I don't know if anybody else uses that, but crank up the ISO is one of my favorite terms. Speaking of terms that I think maybe only I use clunky all the time. It's kind of a funny word. Basically, I use it if I'm shooting and I'm not really paying attention to what my shutter speed is, and when you take the image, you don't get that nice crisp shutter sound because you're not getting a fast shutter speed. If I'm shooting a quarter of a second or a fifth of a second or something like that, and I didn't realize that the shutter will kind of have a bump bump sound rather than a snap sound. And to me, it just sounds clunky. And I'll say, oh no, that was a clunky one, and I'll have to change my settings and do it again. So clunky is one of the terms I use. I don't know if anybody else does, but clunky is one of my favorites. So we're talking about fast shutter speeds versus slow shutter speeds, and maybe not getting a clear image because you have some camera shake. The term sharp. Sharp refers to how sharp the image is, how well everything is focused, and how well the camera is held steady so that there's no motion blur, nothing's out of focus in your subject. That's sharpness. So you always want to have a nice sharp image, at least of your subject. If you're shooting with a shallow depth of field and getting some nice bokeh in the background, you still want your subject to be nice and sharp. So you want to have a fast enough shutter speed so that you don't have any camera shake, and you want to have your focus dead on so that you're focusing right on your subject. That's a nice sharp image. So what about lighting? Oh, there's some lighting terms. Well, there's a lot of lighting terms. You have hard light, which is when you have a nice bright sunny day, not a cloud in the sky. Everything is half in sun, half in shadow. Whether you're trying to take a picture of someone outside and basically their eyes are completely in shadow and it just looks like they're the Phantom of the Opera. To throw some flash in there, pop a flash in there, you'll fill in those shadows. Shooting landscapes is kind of tough in those conditions too. It's hard to shoot in a hard light. You really want a nice soft light. Soft light is basically where it's daytime, you have enough light, but there's a nice cloud cover, enough of a cloud cover where it's not stormy and dark, but it just diffuses the light. It diffuses the sunlight. I mean, sometimes it could just be amazing. You're just like bathed in a nice soft glow. Everything's nicely and evenly lit. It's a great way to shoot landscapes. It's great for really almost any situation, a nice soft light. So you want to have a nice soft light as opposed to a hard light. Hard light will give you images that are sometimes blown out. Blown out basically refers to the brightest spot of an image being overexposed, blown out past white. A lot of cameras will have, in your preview after you take a picture, will actually have the blown out highlights will blink, so you can actually at first glance you'll see it'll be a warning like, well, these spots are blown out and maybe you want to decrease your exposure a little bit and darken it, or maybe the blown out highlights are okay if it's a little piece of the sky and you don't mind that part being blown out, or for whatever effect you're trying to go for, you don't mind a street light or something, that middle of that being blown out, it doesn't matter. Blown out refers to basically the highlights of an image that are beyond white, that are not recoverable, blown out. But speaking of light again, the best light is referred to as golden hour or blue hour. Golden hour basically is the hour or so before sunset, when the sun is low on the horizon. It's being filtered and diffused through a lot more atmosphere, so it's not as bright. It has a nice warm tone to it. Everything kind of like gets a little bit orangey and yellowy. It's just a nice golden light that you get basically the hour or so before sunset, before the sun drops below the horizon. Blue hour is the hour or so after sunset. Once that sun actually drops below the horizon and it's not illuminating, where you're shooting anymore, the sky basically turns a nice color of blue. It's not dark yet, it's not nighttime, but the sun is down, and rather than the sky being black, it's got a nice blue color to it, and everything around is illuminated by either ambient light or artificial lighting. Everything kind of takes on a nice bluish feeling, but it's a great time of night to shoot, especially like in cities with artificial lights and things like that, where the sun has just dropped below the horizon and the sky is still a nice color of blue and everything's still illuminated enough to be able to see it. It's not dark at night. That's blue hour. That's one of my favorite times to shoot. So that's a bunch of photography terms. I'm sure there's some that I missed. Definitely whatever I missed, put it in the comments below. I'd love to hear some other things. If there's some terms that you guys have, terms and words that you guys have that are unique to you, that you use, I'd love to hear those. I love stuff like that. So share those in the comments below also. But I hope you found this helpful. Hopefully you learned a couple of words maybe you didn't know, and you can go and wow your photography buddies with some new words and new information. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.